Welcome to this session of the course Skills for Effective Negotiations. In this session, we will be discussing three key elements related to negotiations: power, culture, and gender. For each of them, we will go over some of the important dynamics and then what can we do to address each one of them. As we've been trying to do throughout this course, we'll try to keep the discussion practical and focused and something that you can walk away with hopefully good skills in this direction. Without any further ado, let's go to the presentation and discuss each of those elements. So, for this session, the discussion is culture, gender, and power. Let us start with culture. Of course, I mean, the relationship of culture to negotiations is so huge. And as a matter of fact, for anything we do in our life, culture is just like the water for the fish. The fish cannot live without the water, but sometimes maybe it doesn't realize that there is water that without it, it wouldn't be able to survive. Culture is the same for us. In particularly negotiation situations, I try to pin it down to specific elements that may be highly influenced by culture. Let's look at them. Number one is how to deal with relationship. Cultures vary in their sense of what a relationship is, and particularly the bond in the relationship. What is connecting people with each other? And I'm not talking only about blood related people, even social context relationships or relationships in workplace and so on. In many societies, things are so interrelated. The notion of individualism, as we know it in the West, particularly in North America and Northern Europe, is not the same as in many places in the world. And therefore, when you enter into negotiations, it is critical to understand where you stand vis-a-vis the other in terms of the relationship. And what does it mean in terms of how you are connecting and how you are relating? If this is not understood, it can create a lot of problems. Sometimes respect is expected. Sometimes certain distance is expected. Sometimes putting the we as the important dimension of the negotiations is important. And so the framing of things will be critical in this case. So relationship and how, what does it mean to someone in this context? And I advise not to think of relationship only in terms of the close relatives, but think about it also even in where you wouldn't expect that it will make a difference. As a matter of fact, it is often that you find that in a public setting or in a workplace where there can be an assumption that things can be just professional and distant and neutral and so on. But no, as a matter of fact, if relationship is framed in a certain way in some cultures, it may actually influence even how people interact in a public space or in a workplace. Second one is the styles and patterns of communication, especially the nonverbal. I am sure all of you, from your experience, you have seen how people relate differently, how they express what they want, how they use the nonverbal. I mean, we saw in the first session about the head shake in India. And what does it mean? And I have to say, I was one of the people who was really affected negatively by it because the first time I worked with an Indian in the United States 33 years ago, and I didn't understand any of their communication styles or body language. And I remember we'd be working together, and I would ask him if a certain task was done, and he would be so busy, and he would just do like this. And I thought that he meant that no, it's not. So I go check, and I found that it was done. So I wondered, why is he actually not lying to me? Why is he making it sound like he didn't do it when he actually did it? It took me a long time to understand that this meant yes for him. Of course, there are so many other elements like this in nonverbal communication. And it is important to also, again, don't assume that what works for you is going to work for others. And if you find that there is a certain pattern of communication that doesn't seem to fit with what you expect, Don't take it to mean something negative or positive, but instead try to investigate, especially if it doesn't resonate with what is being said. I think that there are so many examples of this, that somebody can be silent when you expect them to be jubilant and speaking, or making eye contact, especially when, and they are not making it when you think this is the right time to make it. And this can be very confusing. So suspend your judgment, try to understand, and even ask around if you have the chance to make sure that you are understanding this communication. And it's not only about the nonverbal, it's about, I would say, even sometimes the passion that comes out in negotiations. In some cultures, actually, like raising voice and getting the emotions out is something that is seen as a natural piece of the negotiations, especially when there is a conflict. In other places and in other teachings and education and training, we try to help people to control their emotions. But there is another school that says that it's not okay to keep suppressing emotions. So how emotions are expected to be reflected, at least in the early stage of negotiations, it may vary. And in some cultures, actually, if it doesn't come up first, then something is wrong. There is an expectation that first is going to be escalating in emotions, and then there will be calming down, and then we come to a good point that we say, thank God that we knew how to solve this problem, and now we are even stronger in our relationship and connection. Uh, I think that we need to be cognizant that things can be different. The third dimension that culture can influence in negotiations is how we formulate interests. And I found that a big difference is between cultures, especially when, what we call Western cultures. And when I say Western, I often do this, quote unquote, because it's not the entire West, but it is a dominant dimension or version of culture that seem to exist in many Northwestern countries, in the US, in Canada, in Northern Europe. But again, I'm not going to generalize or stereotype. However, um, key values in such Western culture is about individualism and materialism and secularism. That's a whole other, of course to talk about those issues. But the point I want to make is often the formulation of interests in such context will be highly focused on the material dimension and individually how each person or individual in a conflict will define their own interest, usually in a tangible material way. And then the other side will also try to identify theirs. And then principled negotiations is about how we get them to talk to each other effectively so that they can satisfy the interest mutually. Great stuff. But in other contexts, it is difficult to get people to pin down their interests in a tangible material way and in an individualistic way. As a matter of fact, people would shy away from defining their interest in an individualistic manner. They will be afraid that they will be called selfish or only think of themselves, which is seen as something very bad in many cultures. Instead, they try to formulate their interest within the wider interest of everyone else. And that's the only legitimate way that you can speak about interests. In addition, some of them, they have interest that goes beyond the immediate gain. By this, I mean, think of a context where people are highly religious, where they have certain values come from religious or spiritual beliefs that makes them think that I should behave in a certain way in this situation. Or, and that's what I saw often in many cultures, that some people will be worried about their accountability in the hereafter, on the judgment day. And for them, that's a big interest, is how am I going to make things happen in a way that will please my God? That when my God confronts me on the judgment day, I will say I did things right and so on. This may sound like a foreign concept to some, but for others, it is very real. And as we are talking about culture here, all I'm saying is be aware of it. I'm not trying to say do it this way or don't do it that way, but I am saying if you encounter it, be aware of it. If you think it is playing in the background, investigate it and understand it. So how people will formulate interests, it doesn't follow necessarily the classic models that we are trained to do coming from Western literature. Sometimes people can follow this very well, and sometimes they have difficulty adhering to it. So we got to be careful how we do that. And then the fourth one is the legitimacy of parties. Who counts or who matters? And here I find that also in some settings, we try to identify parties to the conflict in terms of, or negotiations, in terms of who has immediate stake in the situation. And there is an assumption that the fewer the better. I mean, and by fewer, I mean less, the less people, the less parties in the negotiations. Only those who have a stake and they can make a decision are the ones who need to be on the table, which is again excellent. However, in many other settings, there are situations when people feel, and that connects to the issue of formulating interest, that the interest I have is relating to the interest of my family members, is the interest of the larger group that I relate to. And therefore, I cannot make a decision or I cannot negotiate without having them with me at the table. Think actually what happened 2 weeks ago when we did the role play of negotiating the salary and the job. And how many of you said that I cannot make the decision alone? I need to go back to my family or to my spouse and discuss. It shows you that true that the family members probably couldn't be at the table negotiating with you your job and your salary. However, they are part of what we call here the ones behind the scene, and their influence is significant. So who comes to the table can be an issue to consider in negotiations. And again, don't assume that what you know about who should come and who shouldn't come is something that will work perfectly the way you anticipate it. No, people have other ways of assuming what works and what doesn't work in terms of legitimacy of parties. And in terms of those behind the scene, and that will relate even more to the gender issue later. In many cultures, I have seen that women are not encouraged, especially in rural areas in many parts of the world, to have a space or to have a place to speak in the public sphere. However, that doesn't mean they don't have a voice. As a matter of fact, the men negotiating in the public space are always cognizant that when they go home, they will be accountable to those women. And they need to make sure that they get their consent and get their advice as well. And that's a dynamic that we have seen works in many, many places. So understanding those dimensions is something that you keep in mind. I listed those four because I think they are the most prevalent, but I am sure that there are other dimensions of negotiations that are influenced by culture as well. Rule of thumb, avoid generalizing and stereotyping, because you cannot say, oh, all Egyptians, all Indians, all Americans, all, it doesn't work, or all, no, it doesn't work this way. People are different. And even within one culture, people are different. And therefore, jumping in with generalizing and stereotyping about them is actually can be very detrimental. If I, as somebody coming from a certain culture, and then I find that somebody else is treating me as if I have to fit a certain stereotype, good or bad, I will feel offended probably, especially if it is carrying with it some type of a negative connotation. And so be careful about it. Don't assume that because the general concept about people from a certain part of the world or a certain culture is that they are one, two, three, that every one of them is going to be fitting this. No. And I think assess always, suspend judgment, understand the individual, and then see accordingly what works. Diversity exists within cultures for sure. Now, on the issue of power. So now, of course, that is always a big question. When there is power asymmetry, somebody seems to have all the cards and the other one has very little. Does this mean that it is fait complet, that it is definitely going to be that the powerful one will win everything and the weaker one cannot do anything and just have to accept whatever crumbs are offered? Not necessarily. As a matter of fact, it's when you realize that there is a power difference, we advise that number one, acknowledge that there are different sources of power. Let me give you a context of a workplace. Say that you are like the manager or director in your workplace, and you are the direct supervisor of someone, and you need to negotiate with her or with him on a certain issue. Obviously, in this situation, you have so much power and you can actually dictate what happens by virtue of the procedural power that is given to you and the administrative power that is given to you. Let us assume that in this negotiations, you want to do something that is not really what the other side feels is okay. But he or she, they realize that actually they cannot stand up for you directly and say, no, it doesn't matter. I mean, you can disagree with them, but as the boss, they can dictate what they want. But you feel that this is very wrong or it is really violating something important for you. So where do you have other sources of power? Probably, if you start to investigate and look around, you will realize that I do have other sources of power. It's not only about that vertical relationship that my boss is up here, I am lower here, and he or she can dictate. Well, think horizontally. You probably are more connected to other employees and other staff members. And if you find that by connecting them or engaging them in this discussion, that will give you power. And as a matter of fact, your boss may be worried that if he or she dictates something that they know that's going to be harmful to you, even though they think it is right, they will be worried that of the consequences to how this will affect the others in the workplace and how the others will relate to her or to him as the boss. So that actually would weaken his or her power in the situation because you have a stronger power actually in terms of your networking with your peers and how this can be a concern for the boss. So if worse come to worse, you may consider that you need to create some type of situation where, and which is number 4 here, join a coalition, develop some type of a group that will support each other. And in that support, you will be stronger vis-a-vis that one boss. And in doing this, you may find that you can actually balance the power situation because he or she as well will now be concerned about the losses of because of her or his decision and how this will influence the atmosphere of the workplace. And that kind of also flows nicely into the second one, entangling the interest of the powerful party with yours. As a matter of fact, I mentioned briefly about an experience I had in Darfur and Kordofan in Sudan, where I went and saw this conflict that has existed for many years between farmers and pastoralists, and because of the decrease in natural resources and climate change, they are being affected negatively in terms of what is available. So the only thing they knew to do was to exercise power in terms of who gets more water, who gets more resources, who goes and cut trees in the forest, and so on. It was all about power. However, when the project went, and that's what I was evaluating, the project went with the assumption that if we develop forums for them to actually gain more by working together, the powerful and the weaker one, and have them engage in committees to develop ways to gain from the resources they have, and of course, was putting some resources from the project itself, people found that, wait a minute, we are gaining more by actually negotiating peacefully rather than playing the hard bargaining game or even using violence. And that kind of entangling of interest made it possible for those, the foes, the people who were fighting each other, to realize that we are gaining better by actually working together. My interest and what my ability to achieve my interest in having more water, more resources, more food, and so on, is dependent on you also gaining, and we together sitting and talking about how we can gain together. This entangling of interest is another approach that you can consider when you find that there is one powerful party that thinks that they are getting everything they can. Find for them an alternative where their interest and your interest actually will increase, their satisfaction of your interest will increase by developing a different mode of interaction. And the third one is to study the situation and assess where you may enhance your BATNA. We discussed a lot about BATNA, and that requires that you have a good assessment of not only the one item that the powerful one is negotiating over, you may find that by understanding what they are trying to protect or to gain, what are their real interests and needs, that there are actually other dimensions where you are more powerful, you have more connections in other dimensions, realizing that actually their interest can be best satisfied in other ways. And by doing this homework that can lead you to understand what are the real interests and motivations and needs and yours, and then in the context that around surrounding the two of you or more in the negotiations, you may discover that yes, there are other ways that I can have a stronger BATNA because of those other dimensions that otherwise are not seen when the discussion of negotiations is so focused only on the question of a certain element where the other party has all the power. Expand it and then discover how much more power you have if you expand the understanding. I briefly mentioned number 4, joining the coalition, when I talked about number 1, that what you can do is, if you feel like you are not as powerful, then maybe by joining with forces with others, you will be creating a new front that will be stronger in dealing with the powerful one. And I'll get to that also somewhat when I speak about gender, some of the practices in gender. And number 5 is to engage parties with influence on the powerful party. And that is important in cultures I mentioned that are highly collectivistic, that are about the network, the social network, and how people have influence over the other. And if you find that you are in a situation that the powerful one is not has all the cards of the game, and you are feeling helpless and you cannot actually negotiate with them on those terms, consider bringing a religious leader, bringing a traditional leader, bringing a family member or a community member that you know has good influence of the other side. And that can play a big role. And as a matter of fact, I have seen that happen in reality, in practice, in many countries, especially that the powerful ones usually, when they get another powerful outsider coming to your side and trying to influence them to offer something more reasonable to you, they usually do this as part of a reciprocal game, meaning that the one powerful outsider who comes now into this will ask the powerful one to come down on a price, to come down on something so that they can meet you at a point that you think is acceptable. The powerful party who otherwise was stubborn, when they do this, they probably accept it because they know that there will be a moment when they will go to the other powerful outsider and do the same thing and ask them later to also do them a favor. That reciprocity of favors is actually critical in many dispute resolution models I have witnessed in Iraq, I have witnessed in many places in Africa and in Afghanistan and so on. So in some context, getting another powerful outsider with influence can actually change things. And number 6 is actually if everything fails and it doesn't seem that you will get what you think is appropriate in a certain negotiations because of the power asymmetry, I advise to avoid the negotiations tactically, meaning for the moment, try to delay, to postpone until a better moment. What is it? How do you get to the better moment? One is you try to change some of the conditions. And I think I shared with you, I can't remember if I shared before or not, in the war of 1970, actually before the war of 1973 between Egypt and Israel, when Egypt had lost a big war in 1967 against Israel, and there was no point for Israel to negotiate anything for the Egyptians to get back their land. And at one point, President Sadat of Egypt sent an envoy to meet with Henry Kissinger, who was at that time the State Secretary of the United States, which of course has a great connection to Israel. And he asked him to try to work out something to negotiate some type of a peaceful arrangement where the Egyptians get their land back and the Israelis get the security they are asking for or whatever it is. And Henry Kissinger was very clear. He said to him, why should they negotiate with you? They won the war. They are comfortably sitting in your land, and you cannot bother them, or you have not been able to do anything meaningful to push them back. If I were them, I wouldn't talk to you. So the question was, so what can we do? And Kissinger's direct advice was, you got to shake up the situation first. You're going to have to make some type of military action that gives some respect to your army and to you as a country. And only then, and make the Israelis realize that actually we may lose some if we insist on this status quo. Only then it will make sense to enter into negotiations, and we can come and help with the negotiations. And that's precisely what the Egyptians did in 1973. They fought a war. It was the first war where the Israelis really endured some losses, and it became so problematic for their society in general, and of course to the government who was in charge at that time. And to the point that it made sense for them to explore negotiations with Egypt instead of saying we are powerful, we are in charge, and we don't need to talk to anybody. So trying to affect the conditions, if that's possible, is great. And if all fails again, my last advice is be patient and hope that things will change. And it happens sometimes. And it may be that you are in a situation that you ultimately say that there's the best I can do is to try to negotiate, and hopefully I'll get whatever I can, at least for this moment, and then move on. So if you can be patient also, that will be like your last resort. And again, my rule of thumb here is avoid cookie cutter approaches. In other words, all those six tips we have for you, or elements, none of them is applicable all the time. You have to assess which one works and which one doesn't work in a certain situation, or a combination of some of them. And we come to the third element, gender. And I think that's a very deep issue. And I feel like before we get into what to do, there is something much deeper that we must realize, which is to work on ourselves to acknowledge gender-related, deep-seated cultural patterns, with especially effect on confidence and tendency for competitiveness during negotiations. But of course, the issue of gender and deep-seated cultural patterns, and I dare to say abuses, especially against women, and of course, when we think of sexual orientation in a wider sense, then we know that if we move beyond the binary understanding of male-female, then there has been a lot of excessive abuse to people who adhere or identify with other identities in this regard. Acknowledging this is number one, and that's something you have to work on with yourself. No matter which way you want to go, it's important to accept that yes, there have been deep-seated cultural patterns that made people feel helpless, weak, not worthy, and that continues to affect how they negotiate and how they relate to others. Of course, some became empowered. Some became very assertive and they know how to deal with different situations. But others continue to live with those old patterns. And those old patterns go both ways. It goes to people who have benefited from that situation, especially men, or also it's by virtue of they are thinking that I am in charge when I sit in a negotiations, even the posture, the body language, the way I am confident and I feel like I can negotiate and be competitive, all that stuff is a built-up of a certain culture pattern that gave advantage to one group. But there is another group or other groups that have really gotten the worst of this. And as a result, they have not developed that same confidence or the tendency for competitiveness as much as they deserve to have in certain situations. And therefore, acknowledging this will require from us, no matter whether you are a man, a woman, or identifying with any other sexual identity, we must identify the patterns, number one, for ourselves, whether the pattern of dominance or the pattern of submissiveness. And second is to commit to making change. I feel like this is really a journey inside you before anything else when it comes to gender and negotiations. And with this, which will be also another lifelong journey that doesn't end, it's important to not to isolate the notion of gender, but instead connect it using that method of intersectionality, which is, I think, a very powerful concept, not only for gender issues, but for any other dimensions relating to conflict or negotiations. That I cannot understand a woman, especially if I don't understand her class or understand her culture or age or many other dimensions. And it is the connection between those factors, gender, class, culture, age, and there are so many others, of course, that will make up that human being. And the making up of that human being and the vulnerability or power that may come with one or the other are important for us to understand how I would relate to that person in negotiations. And I would say, again, staying with that element, it is important, again, don't stereotype, don't assume that just because I'm dealing with a woman, for example, just take the one example of a man negotiating with a woman in a business situation, and the man is coming with some of the assumptions of, and maybe he is not aware of them, that I will be the one to know better, I am the one who's smarter, I'm the one to decide. And even if the woman is at my par, like peer, but still, of course, I am the man, so I will know better. Going with those assumptions is not necessarily always going to be the case, whether for the man or for the woman. Maybe another man will not carry such ideas whatsoever. And not every woman will be the one feeling vulnerable. It might be that the woman is actually stronger. So assessing this is important. But whether we understand that the need for assessment or not, I will go back to number one. I say, when it comes to gender, it's a self journey that we all have to embark upon so that we can understand some of the injustices. When I think of gender, also, I would say that that's what inspired me often to think of injustices in other areas. When I think of injustices based on race, based on social class, and so on, I actually learned a lot from feminist and gender literature. Because injustice is injustice when it comes again when it's applied to groups of people. And I think that the literature of gender has been the richest in terms of deconstructing and understanding the dynamics and patterns of injustice. And it is important for us to be aware of them when we enter in any negotiation that has a gender dimension. And but while doing it, also be smart enough and savvy to realize that there is no stereotyping of all women have to be this way or all men have to be this way. I have to say that myself, as a man, Arab, Muslim, Middle Eastern, straight man, sometimes I felt actually that I was the one being subjected to stereotypes in workplaces and in other settings. Because I'm sure any of you, if I say to you, give me some common traits of a straight man, old, Middle Eastern, Arab, Muslim, and I wonder how many positive stereotypes you're going to find about a man like this versus negative ones. And then imagine how, when I enter into situations that people already have made up their mind what I should be based on the stereotype. And then accordingly, when we enter into negotiations, there are assumptions about how I am, and how they actually react to me even before I open my mouth, because they already judged me based on such stereotypes. Imagine the same happening to other people, men or women. And maybe, of course, we need to be also clear and agree from now that when we say gender, we are talking about all forms of gender identity and sexual identity. We are not talking about just women. So the question of how much gender, your gender, will influence or be a factor in how people will relate to you in negotiations is something that can go different ways, not just only about women. However, we are aware also that women have taken the brunt of a lot of the culture abuses over centuries. And that's why we are very aware that we need to question this, especially men, and to be aware of how we should deal with this in a fair way and in a way that rises to the principles that we're talking about when we do negotiations. And of course, number three is getting support during negotiations. Sometimes And I'll give a direct example just to explain it. I work a lot with the Muslim community in United States in terms of mediation training and negotiation training for the communities, not just for the national leaders, but we're talking about community members, just the average men and women living in the United States and beyond. And I give them training on negotiation and mediation and so on. I train sometimes the religious leaders, the imams in the mosques, because they are often engaged in mediating between spouses and other family disputes. And I actually found that some of the imams, they resort to a very interesting technique. When they bring a husband and wife to some type of mediation or help them to negotiate, when they realize that the husband is stuck in their culture pattern that is influenced by some confused religious interpretations, that means that the man is in charge and the woman has to be listening to the man and so on. When they realize that this pattern exists and the woman is being submissive or weak or vulnerable, they actually advise the woman to find a friend or a colleague or someone they trust to come with them during the negotiations. And they ask them to bring somebody who's assertive enough, who will know how to stand up so that they can balance the situation between the man and the woman. So that too is at one technique that can be used. If you realize that one side, because of gender dynamics, is vulnerable or afraid or scared or don't know how to articulate it, then it might be a good advice to see who can come and give them the support and the aid so that they can create almost like a coalition, like we mentioned earlier, to be at equal par with the other side who is acting out of a sense of culture power because of gender dimensions. Those are possible three approaches to gender. And again, the rule of thumb, avoid stereotyping and generalizing. Things are changing rapidly, and I think that we cannot just easily have a blanket judgment on people, men, women, or otherwise. That's pretty much all I wanted to share with you for this session. And of course, what you need to do now is to watch this presentation. I hope you already watched it now. Prepare for the role play. I'm going to send you on Thursday your roles. And as I mentioned, there will be one role play where the three men will be in a situation with three women. And then the rest of the group will have a different role play that doesn't have a gender dimension. Keep up with the readings and the videos. And there's an interesting video of my good friend and colleague Joshua Weiss, who worked with the Harvard program on negotiations. And it's about power and the Pat Batna and negotiations. I think he was very clever in the way he did it. So I will be posting this. Please watch it. It's like 5 minutes or 7 minutes. And then, of course, to complete your forum post. And I will look forward to see you for the webinar session where we're going to actually do the role play. Thank you so much for listening and all the very best. And let me just stop the sharing so that I can see you and you can see me and say thanks a lot. See you and in peace. Amr.